3 empty prison cells, broken concrete floors, guards shouting in Spanish, blood-red sunrise over Mexico's most dangerous prison. That was the scene on a cold morning in 1972. Just hours earlier, 3 young Americans had pulled off something that seemed impossible. They dug their way out of a place where most prisoners only left in handcuffs or body bags. But let's back up 72 hours. Deep underground, in complete darkness, Mike Cook is hitting a concrete wall with a butter knife. His hands are bleeding. Sweat drips from his face. Behind him, his 2 friends, Stanley and Paul, are whispering, "Hurry up, the guards are coming." They have exactly 3 minutes before the night patrol walks past their cell. If they're caught now, they'll never see daylight again. And what the guards don't know is that these 3 Americans are hiding an even bigger secret, one that could get them killed. This isn't just another prison break story. This is about how 3 normal guys who went on a fun boat trip to Mexico ended up in one of the worst prisons in the world. It's about friendship, survival, and doing whatever it takes to stay alive. The real photos of these men are right here. They're old now, but back in 1972, they were just like any other young Americans looking for adventure. What they found instead was a nightmare that would test them in ways they never imagined. What happened next is so crazy that if it wasn't true, you wouldn't believe it. In 1972, Mike Cook, Stanley May, and Paul Smith were just 3 friends from California. Mike was 24, worked as a mechanic, and was always the one coming up with crazy ideas. Stanley, 23, had just finished college. And Paul, the youngest at 21, was saving up to buy his own surf shop. The 3 of them pooled their money, about $2,000, and bought an old boat with both an engine and a sail. It wasn't much to look at, but it was their ticket to adventure. Their plan was simple: sail down the Mexican coast, surf some waves, and have the best summer of their lives. Back then, things were different. You didn't need a passport to cross into Mexico. The borders were pretty relaxed, especially if you were traveling by sea. Sure, there were some Coast Guard patrols looking for drug smugglers, but 3 guys on a beat-up boat. Nobody gave them a second look. Everything was going great until they reached Mazatlan. That's when their engine died. Not just a small problem. The whole thing was finished. They tried fixing it themselves, but nothing worked. They had about $300 left, and fixing the engine would cost way more than that. That's when they met this taxi driver. He offered to sell them some hashish. Really cheap stuff, way cheaper than what they'd get back home. Mike, always thinking ahead, did some quick math. If they bought hashish here and sold it back in California, they could make enough money to fix their boat and keep traveling. Looking back now, it's easy to see how dumb this idea was. But when you're young, broke, and stuck in a foreign country, even the worst ideas can start to sound good. The taxi driver told them he could get them more hashish, a lot more. He drove them up this mountain road, way out of town. That's when things started feeling weird. These 3 California surfers, following a stranger they couldn't even talk to, driving deeper and deeper into the Mexican mountains. They didn't know it yet, but this decision would change their lives forever. And not in a good way. The taxi dropped them in the middle of nowhere, just mountains, dust, and silence. That's when they saw this guy walking toward them with a donkey. The donkey was loaded with bags, more hashish than they'd ever seen in their lives. Here's where things got messy. The farmer thought they were big-time buyers. The 3 friends pulled out their $300. Trying to explain it was all they had. Nobody spoke each other's language, just a lot of angry gestures and shouting. Finally, the farmer threw up his hands and took their money. He gave them 6 huge bags of hashish. Each of them had to carry 2 bags down the mountain. The taxi driver, he was so mad about not getting a bigger cut that he dumped them at the edge of town. Imagine this: 3 white guys walking through a Mexican town, each carrying 2 bags of drugs. Then they saw him, a police officer, standing right on the corner, maybe 60 feet ahead. Their hearts stopped. Mike whispered to his friends, "Don't run. Just walk past him like nothing's wrong." They were sure they were about to spend the rest of their lives in prison. But somehow, they'd walked right past that cop. They even said hello to him. Back at their boat, they had another problem: where to hide all this stuff. They were surfers, so they had an idea. They cut open one of their surfboards, took out the foam, and stuffed all the hashish inside. They fixed it up so good that nobody would ever know what was inside. That's when they met the Sierra brothers, Frank and Dan. These guys seemed like a gift from heaven. They had a working boat and offered to take our 3 friends back to America. Too good to be true, right? It was. The Sierra brothers weren't just helpful Americans. They were drug smugglers. And their boat wasn't just carrying our 3 friends. It was carrying a ton of hashish. Not kilos, a literal ton. The brothers offered them each $10,000 to help smuggle it back. The 3 friends agreed without thinking twice. Money can make you stupid like that. They were 7 days into their journey home when everything went wrong. Their boat hit something in the dark. Within minutes, they were swimming in the middle of the ocean, watching their boat. And all that hashish sink into the black water. But that wasn't even the worst part of their night. The waves threw them onto a beach in the pitch-dark night. They were lucky to be alive, but that luck wasn't going to last long. When the sun came up, they saw something that made their blood run cold. Hundreds of bags of hashish scattered all over the beach. The waves had washed up everything from the boat. If anyone saw this, they'd call the police in seconds. They started running up and down the beach, grabbing bags as fast as they could. No tools, nothing. Just digging holes in the sand with their bare hands. Then they saw some locals walking toward the beach. Frank and Mike ran to distract them while the others kept burying bags. Frank knew some broken Spanish, just enough to ask for help. The locals had a truck and agreed to drive them to the nearest town. They thought they'd made it. They were wrong. Halfway through that drive, their truck stopped. Another car was coming toward them, lights flashing. Police cars, lots of them. Guns drawn. Game over. The cops dragged them to the police station one by one. That's where things got really ugly. They shoved papers in front of them. Confession papers, all in Spanish. None of them could read a word. When Paul tried to ask what he was signing, an officer put a gun to his head. The next thing they knew, they were being thrown into this prison. Not some normal prison with cells and guards and rules. This place was like stepping into hell. Picture a concrete yard with 2 walls, an inner one with broken glass on top, and an outer one where guards stood with guns. Inside, pure chaos. Hundreds of inmates, most of them gang members and drug addicts, all running wild. The guards just locked the main door and left you to figure things out. You had to find your own cell, your own food, your own way to stay alive. That first night, lying on those dirty concrete floors, they knew 2 things for sure. They weren't going to survive 25 years in this place, and they had to find a way out. But how do you escape from a prison where even the guards are afraid to walk around? That's when Mike remembered something. A movie called The Great Escape. They'd all seen it. World War II prisoners dug a tunnel right under the Nazis' feet. If those guys could do it, why couldn't they? But digging through dirt is one thing. Their cell floor, solid concrete. All they had was a butter knife they bought from another prisoner and a rock they stole from some workers fixing a wall. Not exactly prime tunneling tools. They moved a bed against the wall and hung up a sheet. Their workshop. One person would dig while 2 others kept watch. If anyone came close, they had signals. 1 cough meant stop digging. 2 coughs meant guards coming. 6 weeks. That's how long it took them just to break through the concrete. 6 weeks of hitting that floor with a rock and a butter knife, trying not to make noise, their hands bleeding and blistered. Finally, they broke through. But what they found underneath nearly broke their spirits. Mud. Not just damp soil, but waterlogged mud that kept filling with water. 3 days they spent trying to scoop out that water, dumping bucket after bucket into the toilets. Then something happened that changed everything. The prison's water got cut off. Some main pipe had broken. After a few days, that wet mud under their cell, bone dry. They started digging like crazy. Each of them would dig for 5 to 6 hours straight. The tunnel was tiny, just wide enough for their shoulders, like being buried alive. But after what they'd been through in that prison, being buried alive didn't seem so bad. But they had a big problem. What to do with all the dirt they were digging up? The whole prison yard was concrete. They couldn't just dump it anywhere. Their solution: hide it under their beds. Real smart, right? But they had no choice. They dug about 15 feet when Paul hit something in the tunnel. He came out looking like he'd seen a ghost. "Guys," he said, "I think I just broke the main sewer pipe." The smell hit them before he even finished talking. The smell was like nothing you can imagine. Their whole tunnel was filling with sewage. If anyone noticed that smell spreading through the prison, the guards would come looking. Game over. None of them wanted to go near that broken pipe. Would you? That's when they thought of Benny, another American prisoner who was always high on something. They figured he might be desperate enough to help. "Fix the pipe, and you can escape with us," they told him. "Plus, you'll get money and all the drugs you want when we're out." Benny crawled into that tunnel covered in, well, you can guess what. He had a coffee can full of cement they'd gotten from some workers. Somehow, he managed to patch that pipe. When he came out, he looked like he'd been to hell and back. But he'd earned his ticket out. Now they were 6. The tunnel was getting longer, but time was running out. They worked 18 hours a day, taking shifts. Mike made this weird periscope thing with a mirror and his wooden flute so they could see what was above them. Then came the rain. Water started pouring into their tunnel. They sat in their cell all night, sure the whole thing would cave in. But somehow it held. They got lucky, really lucky. The Sierra brothers had arranged for 2 cars to pick them up outside the prison. They had to break out that night. At 2 a.m., all 6 of them crawled into the tunnel, wearing their clothes inside out, so they could flip them clean side out later. Mike was in front with a mask, digging the final few feet. When he poked his head out, his heart nearly stopped. They'd come up right under the prison lights. One wrong move, one guard looking down at the wrong moment. But they had no choice. It was now or never. One by one, they squeezed out of that hole, pressed themselves against the outer prison wall. They were literally standing in the spotlights. The main gate was right there, with guards posted above. Then Mike remembered something. That day they walked past the cop while carrying hashish. Sometimes the boldest move is the safest. They dusted themselves off, flipped their clothes right side out, and just started walking. Not running, not sneaking, just walking like they belonged there. Past the main gate, past the guards, past everything that had kept them locked up for 7 months. Their hearts were beating so hard they thought the guards would hear them. But nobody stopped them. Nobody even looked twice. Once they were far enough, they ran. Ran like they'd never run before. But when they got to the meeting spot, no cars. The brothers' contacts hadn't shown up. Dan had a backup plan. Another spot near some railroad tracks. Dawn was breaking. If the guards did their morning count and found them missing, every cop in Mexico would be looking for them. Finally, they saw headlights. 2 cars. Their ride to freedom. The original 3 friends got in one car, the brothers and Benny in the other. Time to split up. Benny got his reward and disappeared. The Sierra brothers, wanted men in America, headed south into Mexico, never to be seen again. Our 3 friends, they still had their passports. The prison had kept them as ID. They made it to the border, walked right through. Just like that day with the cop and the hashish, sometimes the simplest way is the best way. Those 3 young guys who went looking for a summer adventure. They're old men now. They never saw each other again after that escape. But sometimes, late at night, they'd probably still dream about that tunnel that walked past the guards and how they found freedom in the most dangerous way possible. If you ever think you're having a bad day, remember these guys. Sometimes the only way out is through. Even if through means crawling under a Mexican prison with a butter knife and a whole lot of hope. That's their story. No movie magic, no special effects. Just real people making real choices, good and bad, and living with the consequences.